My driveway was blocked again. Not by accident, not by some careless delivery guy, but by the HOA president herself, Karen. Her oversized SUV sat squarely in the middle of my entrance like a throne, as if she owned not just my driveway but my entire life. When I confronted her, she smiled that infuriating, condescending smile and told me, "Your house is an eyesore and we can't have property values dropping because of it." Just like that. No apology, no remorse, just pure entitlement. I had tried reasoning, I had tried playing nice, but Karen was the kind of person who thrived on making others miserable. So I let her think she had one. I pretended to comply, nodding along with her ridiculous demands while secretly planning the most humiliating, legally devastating revenge she could ever imagine. Want to know how it all played out? Stick around, because this is one HOA story you won't forget. Karen had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved into this neighborhood, but I never imagined she would go as far as she did. My house, my driveway, my peace, nothing was safe from her overreaching grasp. It started small, as these things often do. First, it was a warning about my mailbox. "It's not the approved HOA standard," she had said, standing in front of my house with that clipboard she carried like a weapon. Then came the letters about my lawn, nitpicking over the shade of green and the exact height of the grass. But the real battle began when Karen decided that my house was an eyesore and therefore unworthy of unrestricted access to my own driveway. I'll never forget the first morning I woke up to find her massive SUV parked directly across my entrance, blocking me in as if she had staked a claim to the very ground I owned. At first, I thought it was a mistake, that maybe she had been in a hurry or had just pulled in for a second. But when I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and asked her about it, she didn't even try to hide her smugness. "Your house isn't in compliance with the neighborhood aesthetic," she said, folding her arms as she leaned against the hood of her vehicle. "Until we can resolve these issues, I don't think it's appropriate for you to have unrestricted driveway access." I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. "Karen, are you seriously blocking my driveway because you don't like the way my house looks?" She didn't even hesitate. "It's not about what I like," she said with that patronizing tone she always used when she was explaining something to people she considered beneath her. "It's about property values. And quite frankly, your house is dragging down the whole street." My house was fine. It was well-maintained, freshly painted, and structurally sound. But it didn't conform to Karen's ideal of cookie-cutter suburbia. It wasn't the exact shade of beige that she had unilaterally decided was best for the neighborhood. It had character, something Karen clearly despised. "Move your car," I said, my patience wearing thin. She just smiled, sipping her iced coffee. "I'll move it when we've discussed your compliance issues at the next HOA meeting." And just like that, she got back into her car, rolled up the windows, and pretended I wasn't there. I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to do something that would get me in real trouble. Instead, I did the rational thing. I called the towing company. "Sorry, sir," the guy on the phone said after I explained the situation. "We don't tow vehicles involved in HOA disputes. Too much legal gray area." That's when I realized exactly how deep Karen's grip on this neighborhood ran. The HOA wasn't just a set of rules to her, it was her personal kingdom, and she was the queen. The next few days were a nightmare. Every morning, Karen's SUV was parked in front of my driveway, ensuring that I had to maneuver around it just to get to work. It wasn't technically illegal since she was on a public street, but it was blatant harassment. The HOA board, which was stacked with her loyal followers, ignored my complaints. I was slapped with new fines, this time for failure to maintain driveway functionality, which was Karen's way of punishing me for not using my driveway that she had blocked. When I tried to have a reasonable conversation with her, she simply laughed. "You should really consider making some improvements to your property," she said, waving another violation notice in my face. "A new coat of paint, some fresh landscaping, it would go a long way." "A new coat of paint?" I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. "Yes," she said, as if she were being helpful. "The board has been discussing a more uniform color palette for the neighborhood. You should really think about making a change before we have to enforce it." That's when I knew this wasn't just about a personal vendetta. Karen was power-hungry, and I was just the latest target of her reign. She wanted to push me until I either complied or left, handing my house over to someone who would fall in line with her oppressive standards. But I wasn't going anywhere. That night, I sat in my garage, staring at the growing pile of violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. Karen thought she had one, that she could bully me into submission like she had done to so many others. But she didn't know me. I wasn't the kind of person who backed down. I started researching, combing through the HOA's rulebook, city regulations, property laws, anything I could find that would give me leverage. I read about past disputes, cases where HOAs had overstepped their bounds. The more I read, the more I realized something: Karen wasn't invincible. She had built her power on intimidation, not actual authority. The rules were there, and if I played my cards right, I could use them against her. I had to be patient. I had to make her think she was winning. So the next morning, when I saw her standing in front of my house, clipboard in hand, ready to issue another fine, I smiled. "You know what, Karen? You're right," I said, feigning defeat. "Maybe I should look into making some changes." Her expression lit up, the thrill of victory practically radiating off of her. "I think that's a great idea," she said, already pulling out a list of recommended contractors that just so happened to be connected to her friends. "I'll make sure the board is aware of your willingness to cooperate." I nodded, pretending to listen, pretending to care. But inside, I was already making my next move. Karen had no idea what was coming. She thought I was rolling over, giving in. But in reality, I was just getting started. Karen had no idea she had just set the perfect trap for herself. She thought she had one, that I had been beaten into submission, but in reality, I was just getting started. I played my part well, nodding along as she droned on about acceptable neighborhood aesthetics and the importance of maintaining property values. I even asked for her recommendations, feigning interest in the contractors she oh so generously suggested. She beamed at me, convinced she had finally bent me to her will, and I could practically hear her congratulating herself inside her head. But as soon as she turned her back, I got to work. The first thing I did was buy myself time. I told Karen and the HOA that I was considering a soft remodel of my property, changing minor things that wouldn't actually impact anything. I repainted my fence, not a new color, just a fresh coat of the same one. I trimmed my hedges a little neater. I even had my driveway pressure washed, a meaningless effort that Karen praised as if I had just single-handedly improved the entire neighborhood. But the real reason for these so-called changes was simple: they gave me breathing room. Every minor improvement bought me another week or two, delaying any real confrontation while I worked on something far more important: dismantling Karen from the inside out. I dove deep into the HOA rulebook, printing out every page, highlighting every contradiction, every vaguely worded clause that could be used against her. The more I read, the clearer it became that Karen had been running this HOA like her own personal fiefdom, twisting rules to fit her agenda while ignoring anything that didn't benefit her directly. But I needed more. I needed leverage, something so undeniable that even her staunchest supporters wouldn't be able to defend her. So I started talking to my neighbors, the ones who had been in the neighborhood long before I arrived. It wasn't hard to find people with their own horror stories about Karen. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly widow who had lived here for nearly 30 years, told me how Karen had fined her for installing a wheelchair ramp for her late husband because it was not in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic. The Patel family had been hit with thousands of dollars in violations after Karen decided their decorative stone walkway was too urban. Then there was Mr. Ellis, a retired Marine who had his American flag forcibly removed from his property after Karen claimed it was an unsanctioned modification. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. One night, I met with a group of these neighbors over coffee at Mr. Ellis's house. We shared our stories, our frustrations, and by the end of the night, it was clear Karen had ruled with fear for far too long, and people were tired of it. "The problem is," Mr. Ellis said, rubbing his chin, "she's got the board in her pocket. No matter what complaints we file, they always back her up." That's when I knew I needed something stronger than just community resentment. I needed something that could take her down legally. So I took my research to a lawyer, a guy named Mark who had handled HOA disputes before. When I laid everything out in front of him, the complaints, the selective enforcement, the financial discrepancies I had uncovered in the HOA budget, he whistled low. "This is bad," he said, flipping through the documents. "Like, really bad. If what you're saying is true, she's not just overstepping her authority, she's committing fraud." Fraud. The magic word. Mark explained that many of the fines Karen had issued were unlawful based on arbitrary rules that weren't legally enforceable. Worse, it appeared she had been using HOA funds for expenses that had nothing to do with the community. There were transactions labeled as landscaping fees that led to contractors owned by her cousin. Administrative costs that just so happened to match the amount needed for a luxury HOA retreat she attended last year. Even community improvement projects that had never been completed despite money being allocated for them. This was it. The nail in her coffin. But I wasn't ready to strike just yet. No, Karen still had no idea what was coming, and I wanted her to feel invincible before I pulled the rug out from under her. So I let her escalate. And escalate she did. The fines came faster now, as if she sensed my fake compliance and wanted to press her advantage. First, it was a failure to maintain an appropriate mailbox. Then it was an unauthorized seasonal decoration when I left a single pumpkin on my porch in November. Then it was my driveway again because I had parked too close to the curb even though I was perfectly within legal limits. Every day I'd come home to a fresh violation notice, each one more absurd than the last. But the driveway issue was her favorite. She started blocking it more frequently, parking her SUV across it for longer stretches of time. If I moved my car before she could trap me, she would simply find another excuse to inconvenience me, calling in noise complaints, reporting me for suspicious behavior whenever I had visitors. Even trying to get my trash pickup schedule changed so my bins would overflow. It was exhausting, but it was exactly what I needed. Because while she was too busy harassing me, I was preparing my final move. I had all the evidence now, the fraudulent finances, the selective rule enforcement, the illegal fines, the neighbors ready to testify. All I needed was the perfect moment to strike. And as luck would have it, Karen gave me that moment herself. One afternoon, I came home to find that she had gone too far. Not content with blocking my driveway, she had taken it a step further, calling in a property hazard complaint and having a city inspector mark my house for potential code violations. A city inspector. Karen had actually gone outside of the HOA's authority and tried to get the city involved in her personal vendetta. It was a mistake. A huge one. Because now she had created an official paper trail, a government record of her harassment. And that was all I needed. I called my lawyer. It's time, I said. Karen had spent years using HOA rules as a weapon, bending the system to her will. But she had overlooked one simple fact: rules work both ways. And I had just found the perfect way to turn them against her. The final phase of my plan was in motion, and Karen? She had no idea that her empire was about to crumble. Karen thought she was untouchable, but every tyrant has a weakness. She had spent so long bending the rules to her will that she never considered that someone else might use them against her. That was her fatal mistake. I had spent weeks combing through the HOA rulebook looking for anything that could give me leverage. There were the usual restrictions: property maintenance, landscaping guidelines, vehicle regulations, but buried deep within the mind-numbing legal jargon, I found it. A small, overlooked clause in the HOA's waste disposal policies. Section 14, subsection C. The HOA permits the disposal of biodegradable organic material on private property, provided it does not cause permanent structural damage or violate local health ordinances. The words sat there on the page, innocuous and vague, but they might as well have been a loaded gun in my hands. I reread it multiple times, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. Then I sent a copy to Mark, my lawyer, and asked him if it was as good as it looked. He got back to me the next day with a single sentence: "It's completely legal if you do it right." That was all I needed. If the HOA's own rules allowed for biodegradable material to be dumped on private property, then there was nothing stopping me from making full use of that loophole. The question now was how to weaponize it in a way that would make Karen regret every second of her existence. And then it hit me. Manure. Not just a little. Not just a few shovels full. I was talking about a massive, steaming, unbearable mountain of farm-fresh manure. The kind of smell that seeps into your clothes, your hair, your soul. The kind of stench that lingers for weeks no matter how hard you scrub. The kind that Karen would never be able to ignore. I knew exactly who to call. My old friend, Jake, owned a farm about 20 miles outside of town. He had spent years dealing with HOA nonsense himself before finally moving to a place where no one could tell him how to live. When I told him what I needed, he didn't even hesitate. "How much are we talking?" he asked, already laughing. "Enough to make someone rethink their entire life," I replied. Jake whistled low. "I can get you £1,000. Maybe more." Perfect. Now I just needed a delivery date. It had to be timed flawlessly, ensuring Karen would be the one to suffer the most from it. That meant waiting until she pulled her usual stunt, blocking my driveway with her massive SUV. And given her behavior lately, I wouldn't have to wait long. For the next few days, I played along, keeping up the charade that I was making improvements to my property. I even went so far as to show her a few paint samples, watching her bask in her own delusion of power. Every interaction only made the revenge sweeter. She thought she had me completely under her control. She had no idea that she was about to become the HOA's biggest laughingstock. Then, right on cue, it happened. I woke up one morning and found Karen's SUV parked across my driveway as expected. But this time she had taken it a step further. There were 2 orange traffic cones placed behind her car as if marking her territory. A handwritten sign taped to my mailbox read, "Pending HOA review, do not use driveway." That was it. That was the moment I had been waiting for. I picked up my phone and called Jake. "It's time." You sure about this? He asked, though I could hear the amusement in his voice. Never been more sure of anything in my life. All right, he said, I'll have the truck there in an hour. I spent that hour preparing. I pulled up a lawn chair on my front porch, cracked open a cold drink, and waited. Neighbors were already eyeing me curiously, but no one said anything. They had learned by now that when Karen was involved, things were bound to get messy. And then, like an angel sent from the heavens, Jake's truck came rumbling down the street. It was massive, the bed piled high with fresh, steaming manure. The smell hit before the truck even reached my house. I saw people gagging, covering their noses, retreating into their homes like they were escaping a biohazard zone. But I just smiled. Jake pulled up right in front of Karen's SUV, his window rolling down. You weren't kidding, he said, eyeing the sign she had taped to my mailbox. She really blocked your driveway again? Yup. And you're absolutely sure this is legal? I held up the printed HOA clause. 100%. He let out a low chuckle. All right then. Let's do this. He hit the lever and the truck bed tilted. The sound was incredible, like a slow, rolling avalanche. The manure poured out in a thick, steaming cascade, landing directly on Karen's SUV, covering the hood, the windshield, the roof, and spilling over onto the ground in an unstoppable wave of organic horror. The second it hit, the smell intensified. It wasn't just bad, it was apocalyptic. A thick, pungent wall of pure, undiluted farm stench filled the air, spreading like wildfire through the neighborhood. I saw people scrambling to close their windows, some dry heaving on their lawns. A woman across the street actually dropped her coffee cup and ran inside. And then, just as the last chunk of manure tumbled onto her car, the front door of Karen's house flew open. She stepped outside wearing her usual smug expression until she saw the mess. Her face twisted in confusion, then horror, then sheer, unfiltered rage. What the hell is this? She shrieked, stumbling back as the smell hit her full force. I stood up from my chair, stretching like I had just finished a relaxing nap. Oh, this. I gestured to the massive pile of manure covering her car. Just some biodegradable, organic material. Completely within HOA guidelines. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She looked at the truck, then at me, then at the HOA rulebook still in my hand. You can't do this. This is illegal. This is vandalism. Nope, I said, shaking my head. Actually, it's perfectly legal. Section 14, subsection C. The HOA permits biodegradable, organic disposal on private property. And guess what, Karen? Since you blocked my driveway, your SUV is technically on my property. Her face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. She spun around looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. But there was no one. The neighbors were watching from a safe distance, most of them barely able to hide their laughter. Karen had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist for years, but now? Now she was standing in front of a mountain of her own making, drowning in the consequences of her arrogance. I turned back to Jake and patted the side of his truck. Appreciate the delivery, man. I'll get you that beer I promised. He tipped his hat. Pleasure doing business with you. And with that he drove off, leaving Karen to deal with the reality of her situation. She had wanted to play games, but she never expected that I would play to win. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the smell of fresh disaster was about to fill the air. Karen, in her usual display of entitlement, had blocked my driveway yet again, parking her oversized SUV right where I needed it to be. The ridiculous sign she had taped to my mailbox, claiming my property was pending HOA review, was still fluttering in the wind like some declaration of her dominance. She wasn't even home at the moment, probably off at one of her pretentious luncheons where she and her minions would plot new ways to terrorize the neighborhood. That was fine. It gave me all the time I needed. I pulled out my phone and made the call. Jake, it's go time. I heard the engine roar through the receiver before he even spoke. On my way, he said, the amusement thick in his voice. Minutes later, the ground beneath my feet vibrated as Jake's massive truck rounded the corner, rolling down the street with all the grace of an impending apocalypse. The truck bed was fully loaded, a mountain of fresh, hot manure piled high, ready to be deployed. The smell was already seeping into the air, causing people to stop what they were doing and look around in confusion. Some covered their noses. Some gagged. Some just watched with wide, entertained eyes. Jake pulled up right in front of Karen's SUV, giving me a two-finger salute from the driver's seat. You sure about this? He asked, grinning like a kid about to do something wonderfully stupid. I nodded. Absolutely. He threw the truck into position, the hydraulic lift groaning as it prepared to unleash its payload. I stepped back, letting the show unfold. With a deep rumble, the back of the truck tilted, and then, in one glorious, unstoppable wave, 1,000 pounds of manure cascaded down like a landslide straight onto Karen's beloved SUV. The splattering sound was grotesque, wet, and incredibly satisfying. The first heavy chunks hit the hood, followed by an avalanche that buried the windshield, the roof, and the entire front end of the vehicle. Within seconds, her pristine white SUV was nothing more than a steaming, reeking mound of filth. The smell spread instantly, a toxic cloud of pure farmyard misery rolling through the neighborhood. The reaction was immediate. From their driveways, porches, and front lawns, the neighbors watched, stunned, some covering their mouths in horror, others whipping out their phones to record what was bound to be the most talked-about HOA moment in history. A woman across the street gasped, clutching her pearls like she had just witnessed the collapse of civilization. A couple of kids on bikes gagged dramatically before bursting into laughter. Mr. Ellis, the retired Marine who had been fined for flying an American flag, let out a wheezing chuckle, shaking his head. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, barely containing his amusement. Jake shut the truck bed with a loud clank, nodding in satisfaction. "I'd say that's a job well done," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. I clapped him on the back. "I'll buy you a beer for this." "Hell, make it two," he said before climbing back into the cab and rolling off, leaving behind nothing but a thick stench and a legendary mess. Then, right on cue, it happened. Karen's sleek black sedan came screeching down the street, tires skidding as she turned into the neighborhood. She was back early. Maybe she had gotten a text. Maybe one of her minions had tipped her off. Maybe she just sensed the disturbance in her self-proclaimed kingdom. Whatever it was, she knew something was wrong. Her car barely had time to slow before she slammed on the brakes in front of her house. Her door flew open. The sound of her high heels clicking against the pavement was rapid and angry. And then she saw it. For a split second, there was silence. Then came the scream. A sound so high-pitched, so raw with rage and disbelief, that birds actually took off from the trees. "What the hell is this?" She stumbled back, one hand over her nose as the smell hit her in full force. Her eyes darted to the SUV, wide with horror as realization set in. Her precious, spotless, overpriced vehicle, her status symbol, was buried under a thick, unholy layer of manure. It wasn't just on top. It had seeped into the grille, clogged the windshield wipers, slithered its way into every crevice. The once shiny chrome trim was now completely unrecognizable, the side mirrors barely visible through the filth. Her fingers twitched, clenching into fists, then unclenching as if her brain couldn't decide whether to punch something or cry. I leaned casually against my porch railing, sipping my drink. "Problem, Karen?" She whirled on me so fast I thought she might sprain something. "You," she screeched, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "You did this. You were going to pay for this. I am calling the police. I am calling the city. I am calling." I held up the HOA rulebook, flipping to the page I had highlighted. "Section 14, subsection C," I said smoothly. "The HOA permits the disposal of biodegradable, organic material on private property, provided it does not cause permanent structural damage. And since you so kindly blocked my driveway, your SUV was technically on my property." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her face was a twisted mess of fury and disbelief. Around us, neighbors were murmuring, whispering, laughing. More and more people were recording, capturing every second of her meltdown. You can't," she sputtered. "Oh, but I can," I said, savoring every second. And I did. And it's all perfectly within HOA regulations. She turned in a wild circle, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. But there was no one. The board members she had once controlled were nowhere in sight. Her loyal HOA lackeys were either avoiding eye contact or recording her humiliation for their own entertainment. The very people she had lorded over for years were now watching as she crumbled under the weight of her own arrogance, literally. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any better, a new sound joined the chaos. A deep, guttural splorch. Karen froze. The entire neighborhood went silent. A fresh, heavy glob of manure had just slid off the SUV's hood and landed directly on her designer heels. Her shriek was instant and primal. She leaped backward, nearly losing her balance, arms flailing as she struggled to get away from the growing puddle of filth oozing toward her. But it was too late. The damage was done. Her expensive shoes? Ruined. Her reputation? In tatters. Her reign as the neighborhood's tyrant? Over. She turned to me, face blotchy with rage. "You think this is funny?" she seethed. I took another slow sip of my drink. "Oh, Karen," I said, barely containing my grin. "I think this is hilarious." The neighbors erupted into laughter. Karen, still shaking with rage, let out one last furious screech before storming into her house, slamming the door behind her. And just like that, the queen had fallen. The fallout from Karen's public meltdown was nothing short of spectacular. The manure-covered SUV sat like a cursed monument in her driveway, reeking under the sun, a constant reminder of her humiliation. She had fled inside her house after her tantrum, but the damage was done. The entire neighborhood had witnessed her downfall, and the video footage was already spreading like wildfire. By the time the sun set, clips of her screaming and stomping in horse manure were making their way through social media. I was tagged in a few posts but chose to stay quiet, letting the disaster unfold naturally. Karen, however, was far from done. She had spent years bullying and intimidating the residents of this neighborhood, and she wasn't about to let one spectacular failure bring her reign to an end without a fight. The next morning, a uniformed police officer knocked on my door. I had expected it. "Mr. Walker," the officer said, flipping through a notepad, "we received a complaint of property damage and harassment from your neighbor, Karen Reynolds." I nearly laughed. Of course she would run crying to the police, hoping they would swoop in and save her from the consequences of her own actions. I crossed my arms, leaning against my doorframe. Did she mention that her SUV was illegally blocking my driveway? The officer's eyebrow twitched. "She claims you intentionally dumped hazardous waste onto her vehicle." I held up the HOA rulebook already open to the highlighted section. "Biodegradable organic material disposal is permitted on private property under Section 14, subsection C of the HOA regulations," I said smoothly. Karen blocked my driveway. That made it my property. I simply exercised my rights. The officer scanned the page, his lips pressing together like he was trying not to smirk. "So, let me get this straight. She parked illegally, refused to move, and now wants to press charges because you used HOA guidelines against her." "That about sums it up," I said. The officer sighed, snapped his notepad shut, and muttered, "Figures." Then, louder, "Look, I'll file a report, but honestly, she doesn't have much of a case here." I had expected as much, but Karen was nothing if not persistent. The next day, I received an official legal notice. Karen was suing me for damages, emotional distress, and neighborhood defilement. I had to give her credit for creativity. She really thought she could strong-arm me in a courtroom the way she had bullied this neighborhood for years. Unfortunately for her, I had spent the past month meticulously gathering evidence. I called Mark, my lawyer, who could barely contain his laughter when I explained the situation. "She's suing you over manure?" he said between chuckles. "She thinks she can intimidate me into backing down." "Well, she's about to learn the hard way," Mark said. "I'll get everything prepped." The court date arrived faster than I expected. The hearing was packed, not just with HOA board members, but with curious neighbors who had taken the morning off just to witness Karen's reckoning. Even Mr. Ellis, the retired Marine, was sitting in the back, arms crossed, grinning like he had just been handed front-row tickets to the best show in town. Karen sat at her table, practically vibrating with anger, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. Across from her, I sat with Mark, calm and composed. The judge, a tired-looking man who had likely seen every kind of petty dispute imaginable, called the courtroom to order. "Mrs. Reynolds, you are alleging that Mr. Walker deliberately damaged your vehicle and caused emotional distress?" Karen stood dramatically. "Yes, Your Honor. This man dumped hazardous waste onto my car. My property has been ruined, I have suffered humiliation beyond belief, and the entire neighborhood has been turned against me because of his actions." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Walker, your response?" I stood, holding up the HOA rulebook. "Your Honor, I was following the regulations that the HOA itself enforces. Section 14, subsection C clearly states that biodegradable organic material disposal is permitted on private property. Mrs. Reynolds had parked her vehicle in my driveway, which legally placed it under my property. I simply exercised my rights." The judge took the rulebook, flipping through it. After a moment, he glanced at Karen. "Mrs. Reynolds, is this document accurate?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, her face twitching with barely contained rage. "Well, yes, but—" The judge raised a hand, cutting her off. Then I failed to see the problem. "Mr. Walker followed your HOA's own regulations. Furthermore, your vehicle was illegally obstructing his driveway." Karen shot to her feet. "But enough," the judge said, his patience gone. "Mrs. Reynolds, not only is your claim dismissed, but I am holding you personally responsible for the removal of the waste from Mr. Walker's property. Additionally, given the evidence of your repeated harassment of the defendant, I am ordering an inquiry into your conduct as HOA president." You could have heard a pin drop. Karen's face went from red to ashen white. The judge turned to the HOA board members sitting in the gallery. I strongly recommend that you review your leadership structure before this escalates further. By the time the court adjourned, Karen looked like she had aged a decade. She didn't even look at me as she stormed out, shoving past the crowd of neighbors who were whispering excitedly. The fallout was immediate. A formal complaint was filed against Karen with the HOA board, citing abuse of power, fraudulent fines, and harassment. With the legal spotlight on her, the board had no choice but to investigate. The more they dug, the worse it got. Within 2 weeks, she was removed as president. Within a month, she put her house up for sale. By the time the sold sign was hammered into her front yard, the entire neighborhood was celebrating. Without Karen, the HOA crumbled. People stopped caring about the ridiculous rules, the fines, the arbitrary restrictions. It was like the entire neighborhood could finally breathe again. The board members who had been too scared to speak up before started pushing for reforms, rolling back the most oppressive policies. The mandatory color schemes, the absurd landscaping requirements, the endless bureaucratic nonsense, it was all dismantled. And as for me, I finally got to use my driveway in peace. No more blocked entrances, no more violation notices, no more HOA tyranny. Just me, my home, and a neighborhood that had been freed from its worst nightmare. One evening, as I sat on my porch enjoying the first real quiet I had in months, Mr. Ellis strolled up, beer in hand. He looked at Karen's old house, now empty and lifeless, and let out a satisfied sigh. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, cracking open his drink. I smirked. Took a little creative problem solving, but we got there. Ellis took a sip, glancing at me. "You know, the HOA is holding elections for a new president. You ever think about running?" I nearly choked on my own drink. "Not a chance in hell." Ellis laughed, shaking his head. "Smart man." The neighborhood was finally at peace, and Karen was nothing more than a bad memory. And as I sat there, watching the sunset over my unblocked driveway, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes justice isn't served in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes in the form of 1,000 pounds of manure.